Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our discussion on peace building and disinformation. It's great to see you, so many joining online from all over the world. My name is Nina Stumpf, and I'm working for the Berghof Foundation as well as the platform Peaceful Conflict Transformation, and I'm seconded to the working group Peace and Development. I'm very happy to moderate the session today. Before we start, I would like to say a few words about the topic and the background of today's event. The spread of disinformation is not new, but especially with the rise of AI-driven platforms like TikTok, Instagram, and X, disinformation can spread even faster. It can undermine trust in individuals and communities, but also impact public trust, affecting everything from voter decision-making to confidence in institutions. To illustrate this, a study conducted by the Berghof Foundation in Germany found that 81% of the respondents viewed disinformation as a threat to democracy and social cohesion. This perception is also not isolated to Germany, of course. Disinformation is a growing concern worldwide, with implication for social cohesion, democracy, and peace. Many project initiatives have emerged already to mitigate the spread of disinformation, such as fact-checking, media literacy programs, and platform regulation. Nevertheless, recent decision, I think all of you read it, by major platforms such Meta announced to stop fact-checking, and show difficulties in tackling disinformation. To better understand the challenges and opportunities in addressing disinformation, platform Peaceful Conflict Transformation and the Berghof Foundation commissioned a study on disinformation and the role of peace-building organization. Our goal was to take stock of current peace-building initiatives and the lessons learned so far, while also drawing from insights from other fields, such as cognitive science, to enhance our understanding and responses. We are very happy to present the findings today, and we are really pleased to have such an esteemed group of speakers and panelists with us today. The two authors, of course, you can see them already, Grace Connors and Emma Baumhofer. Judy Hawk, a peace-building practitioner and research lead at Build Up, and John Rosenbeck, a lecturer in psychology and security studies in King's College London. Today we will dive into the question, as I already kind of mentioned, what strategies are peace builders currently using to counter disinformation, what lessons have we learned, and what can researchers from fields like cognitive science and inform and improve our efforts. Thank you for joining us today. Grace and Emma will present the finding of the report, followed by a panel discussion with Julie and John. We really hope it will be a fruitful conversation that sparks new ideas and strategies. And just a quick note before we begin, the event will be recorded. I think you noticed it already. And please feel free to use the question and answer function at the bottom of your Zoom window to ask questions throughout the event. It's only the panelists and me who can see the questions. And just before we dive into the findings of the report, let me introduce you to the authors a bit more in detail. So welcome, Grace Connors. Okay, Grace Connors is a research assistant at the Duke Institute at the Maryland University. She also engaged with the Peace Tech and Polarization Lab at the University of Notre Dame, focusing on the proliferation of hate speech across social media platforms. Her academic background in computer science and peace studies bridges technology and conflict transformation and drives a passion for digital peace building. Also, Emma is passionate about creating bridges between technologists and peace builders. Welcome, Emma. Emma is an expert in digital peace building and interactive design, currently working as an independent consultant. Prior to this, she led Swiss Peace portfolio on technology, conflict and peace, and many of you probably know her from her work there. Thank you both for being here, and we're looking forward to hear more from you. Grace, now over to you. As the lead author of the study, would you like to share some main findings of the report?
Thank you, Nina, for that very warm introduction and for commissioning this study. I know both Emma and myself, before we get kind of into the findings, wanted to take a moment and say a huge thank you to you, to Berghof Foundation, and to the Platform for Peaceful Conflict Transformation for your support of this project. For those that don't know, we've been working very closely with Nina over the past few months, and so we're very grateful for her support. for bringing such a critical conversation to light at a very important moment in time of the information ecosystem. And I know for myself, kind of entering into this paper, it felt so important because when Emma and I were first discussing kind of the challenges of disinformation, I realized that a lot of my grounding came from the 2016 elections. So I'm based in the United States, and I feel like that was the first time I really became aware of the harmful challenges of disinformation, when things like fake news and Russian campaigns started becoming very commonplace in the media. And now 8-9 years later, we're still seeing a lot of those challenges, and we've seen a lot of those challenges worldwide. And so how can we really take the lessons we've learned over the past few years and apply them into the future of disinformation response? So just to make sure we're all on the same page before we get started, I know there's many definitions of disinformation out there. We grounded our study with the definition of disinformation as false or misleading information shared with the intent to harm. And that concept
I think Grace is gone. I don't know if anyone else. Emma?
Yeah, she's frozen for me as well.
No. Let's wait a moment.
Yeah.
Grace, you're back. You were frozen for a moment.
Oh,
Glad to
no,
see you
okay.
again.
Okay, my apologies. Hopefully I didn't lose too much information. I guess what I was in the middle of saying is that disinformation is associated with a lot of other online harms, such as misinformation, hate speech, polarization. But we kind of saw disinformation as a meeting ground for a lot of these issues and a place where a lot of peace builders are currently focused on addressing the issue. And so we wanted to start kind of there. And when we consider disinformation, we sort of conceptualized throughout the paper a life cycle of disinformation and kind of the different actors associated with its creation and dissemination. So first looking at generators, or those who intentionally create disinformation, spreaders, people who intentionally or unintentionally spread it online, as well as recipients, so either people who are kind of innately who believe false information, and also those who are affected by the broader landscape of disinformation within the information ecosystem as well. So we'll return to this chart later in the presentation, but just kind of wanted to highlight that's where we really started the study with. But to look specifically at peace building work, we borrowed this really wonderful chart from a group of other peace builders, Helena Luari of Build Up and Maud Morrison of the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. They kind of built out this chart in a recent paper that they did, and it maps out a lot of online harms and the potential peace building responses associated with them. And you can sort of visualize it as if you, the user, are standing at the top of the pyramid looking out over the harms. So kind of the things at the top are going to be what's most visible or readily accessible to the online user. So things like hate speech or disinformation will affect your day-to-day experience online. But as we get further down the pyramid, we kind of get into these underlying mitigating factors that contribute to conflict online as well. And ultimately, we end up at the bottom of the pyramid, interestingly enough, with things like human communication, human neurology, and social cohesion. And these are really important questions to be asking. How do we talk to one another? How do we process information? And ultimately, how do we relate to one another online? And how does that contribute to building, functioning a social cohesive society? And what we noticed throughout our background research, kind of mapping a lot of current peace building approaches to disinformation, is that a lot of our work as kind of conflict responders focuses a lot on those top layers of the pyramid. So how do we immediately kind of address the pernicious effects of disinformation? And so you'll see things like fact-checking movements, counter-messaging campaigns, storytelling campaigns that sort of address disinformation when it's created and spread online. We see a lot of work on digital literacy and games for peace, which help educate people on how to better interact online. A lot of research on kind of content moderation, how it impacts both the moderators themselves and the online ecosystem. Advocacy around changes that could be made to platform structures. But ultimately, we really wanted to encourage peace builders to think about moving further down the pyramid, start asking those bigger questions of how do we relate to one another, and how do we process information, which comes from that cognitive science research, which I will get to momentarily. But to sort of map out kind of the existing state of peace building responses to disinformation, I held interviews with 4 different peace builders around the world who are implementing some really amazing work to respond to disinformation. And I won't get into too much detail on them just because I want to encourage all of you to read the study. But I think what came out from a lot of these conversations, I spoke with people running sort of media literacy programs, people who have hosted stakeholder convening events to kind of bring together a lot of actors involved in this work, as well as mediators who are working on addressing conflict actors and governing their online behavior. And sort of the broad scope of looking at all of these conversations together sort of came to two big findings. The first probably isn't too shocking to a lot of peace builders in the room. A lot of people are asking for funding, but specifically asking for adaptive funding. So it's not just that these programs need support, it's that they need the support to be able to address new harms as they arise. And so pretty much every conversation that I had with peace builders, both for this study and kind of outside of the scope of the study as well, brought up the concept of artificial intelligence and how its impacts are going to have a huge effect on the online ecosystem, but how these peace builders, since they've been on the ground engaged in this work for so many years, are the ones best equipped to respond to those potential harms posed by AI as well. And so a lot of peace builders requested funding that would allow them to do things such as that, as well as continuing the work that they already do, because a lot of things, especially with programming like media literacy, it needs to be implemented in the long term to be able to have long-term effects. Kind of one-stop workshops aren't always the most effective. And so adaptive funding was highly requested by everyone I talked to. And along the same lines, the concept of partnerships and strategic creative partnerships really came out from all of these conversations, especially from the Reducing Online Conflict Community conversation and the Social Media Peace Agreement conversation. In order to start kind of moving down the pyramid and getting into the roots of conflict and understanding why disinformation is being created in the first place, we need to talk to people across the spectrum of harms and be able to implement holistic solutions that sort of get at a lot of these different conflicts. And I'll let Emma touch on that a little bit later, but I wanted to highlight that now as a really important lesson from the case studies. But again, please read the report for more detail. But getting back into the chart I shared previously, we really wanted to understand, again, those bottom tier questions. How do people relate to one another? How do we process information? And for this, we turned to cognitive science and started to break down across each actor type, sort of why do people create disinformation and why are people susceptible to it? And looking first at generators, we definitely noticed that these actors are typically motivated for financial reasons. There's a lot of money in disinformation creation, unfortunately. We see this also with political or ideological reasons or a desire to disrupt functioning society. Probably the most commonly cited example of this would be kind of Russian disinformation campaigns. Those are definitely driven by a political agenda, attempting to kind of disrupt functioning society in other countries, but this comes out in other ways in other spaces as well. And so this kind of all goes back to that piece of intent. And so asking questions of why does this conflict need to start? What do these conflict actors need? Is something peace builders are really adept at doing. And so we highly encourage peace builders to think about that in their work. Looking at spreaders, this was perhaps the most unique category in my opinion, just because we sort of had two buckets of actors. First is those who are intentionally and kind of self-reportedly intentionally spreading false information, which thankfully is a small subset of society, but still is a significant portion, and those that spread it unintentionally. And so looking first at that bucket of people who spread disinformation intentionally, researchers termed it was a need for chaos, which I found really interesting. And it's a similar idea to those generators, but people who spread disinformation because they feel disillusioned with their stake in society and want to disrupt functioning society in order to call attention to it. And so peace builders, again, it's getting back to conflict transformation of asking what needs of these individuals is not being fulfilled in order to prevent them spreading disinformation in the first place. For those that share disinformation, perhaps unintentionally, this gets more at their behaviors online. So a lot of people build up habits of sharing information and will just share it kind of repeatedly. This goes pretty hand in hand with trust in institutions. You might have 4 or 5 news sources that you consistently repost content from without really critically analyzing the sources of that content. And that can build up quickly the spread of disinformation online. And then lastly, the idea of social belonging. We're human beings, we want to be close to our friends, and so we'll share information to stay in the loop, to not miss out on things, and to make sure that our friends remember that we're there. But that can all kind of, again, compile to the rapid spreading of disinformation online. And then lastly, looking at recipients. Recipients are often susceptible for a variety of reasons, and this is looking specifically at those individuals who believe false information. First was a prior exposure. Anytime you see something online, it kind of builds up a little kernel of truth even if you don't believe it yourself, and after a while, that can make you more receptive to false information. There's also a lot of research around the idea of politics and partisanship, and how that aligns with people's information acceptance online. And while this varies kind of across spaces, there was a definite display of political ideology having an impact on people's ability to process information. And then lastly, we saw that a lack of critical thinking can also contribute to people believing false information. If you kind of passively take in information, again, without critically interrogating its source or what it's saying, you might be more susceptible to false information. I will caveat this with that the research itself comes a lot from global minority countries, and so more research is needed in global majority countries to understand kind of the effect of this across information ecosystems. But again, this had a really strong impact across the research. And so I think with that, I'll pass it off to Emma, because a lot of this ties into the recommendations she was going to share.
Yeah, thanks, Grace, also already for your great overview of the main findings. I find it super interesting, the life cycle of disinformation and the spreaders and generators, and how we could look into it. But I feel like it still sometimes feels like moving against the wind or running against the wind. So I really like now to hear from Emma, which are the main recommendations you see most relevant to combat disinformation.
Great, thanks, Nina. And thanks, Grace, for like teeing up, talking about the recommendations so well. That's really helpful. So for anyone who hasn't seen the report yet, there's 7 recommendations that come out of the report. And I'm gonna highlight one first, and then I do have a couple slides that I'll run through the other ones in a little bit less detail, just so you know what's coming in these next couple of minutes. So the way we formulated these recommendations also is to hopefully make them concrete enough to be actionable, but also with some room in there for our readers to kind of find themselves in maybe the 2 to 3 to 4 recommendations that really fit with your expertise and of yourself and your organization. So hopefully that's how they were designed, at least. And I want to highlight the first recommendation, which is actually to encourage a systems-based strategy for addressing disinformation. And I'm highlighting this one because I think it actually feeds into our thought process for the others, which are maybe a little bit more specific from this. But this recommendation, I mean, on the one hand, it has a practical angle. We have limited resources that are getting even more limited. I mean, it felt limited even when we were writing this at the end of last year. And I feel like every week there's like new news that is reinforcing this point. So part of it is an idea to try to pool our resources and our strategies and our collective kind of knowledge in a more strategic, systems-based way. But there's also a strategy angle that I think, particularly when we're tackling a big global topic and issue like disinformation, that it seems from our research that a like collaborative and interdisciplinary approach is a more impactful one for a big topic like disinformation. And then finally, I want to point out like a human side of this recommendation, which I'm also worried, I think, about peace builders and our colleagues from other sectors exhausting ourselves because of what you just described, Nina, of like just kind of the firefighting, always staying at the top of this pyramid, and just lots of effort and not feeling like there's enough impact. So we're hoping that a more collective or systems level approach can help with this as well. And then just to clarify that we don't mean by this systems-based strategy that it's like one global, one size fits all strategy that we all need to get on board and do. I mean, systems are at all different levels. So we're talking about like local collectives or maybe regional or national policy instruments that can be really effective. Getting smaller programming like peacebuilding programming included into broader peacebuilding processes. So this is really a word for us to find at all the different levels and just to think more collectively in this sense. And then, of course, a big part of it, as Grace already mentioned, is advocating continually with donors to be flexible with the funding and the timeframes and things like that. So with that, I'm going to share slides as well, just to quickly summarize for you what The other recommendations from the report are, and then we can get into the discussion. Bear with me just 1 second while I share this. Okay, so this one I already introduced you to, but another one of our recommendations is to, of course, leverage cognitive science to prioritize preventative programming at the source of disinformation. This is related to what I was just talking about, how we can try to get past this firefighting and look more to root causes of disinformation, and also looking at the specific and localized economic and political conflict drivers that are really allowing disinformation in various places to amplify, and of course always keeping a gender lens, which leads me to the next recommendation, which is to aim for a gender transformative approach to disinformation response. So this is definitely about more access for women and girls to disinformation resiliency programs, but also I think this is a very key moment, and increasingly so, to pay attention to in research and in our programming the role of masculinities and misogyny in the spread and dissemination of disinformation. And then part of this is also thinking about how we can redesign tech platforms to be more inclusive and equitable digital spaces. Oops. There we go. Another recommendation is to integrate strategies into broader peace and mediation or policy efforts. The two examples that are on the slide here come from the case studies, actually, from Center for Humanitarian Dialogue and Berghof. So things about how we can use things that we're already doing against disinformation, like codes of conduct, and how this could be also a trust-building exercise in a mediation process, or how what could start as a smaller media literacy program could grow into a national level or maybe beyond program there. The next recommendation is to decolonize disinformation by investing in local research practice. And this is really about knowledge sharing and also amplifying localized peace building perspectives and learnings on combating disinformation, and also so that organizations are not starting from scratch, that there's also these amplified localized learnings that others can then learn from and build on to conserve a bit of these resources and strategies as well. And here's the last two. They're a little bit more tech focused. I recognize that at this moment, we're not in a very conducive environment, like political environment, for at least the big tech platforms. I don't think to enter into a lot of conversations about changing their platforms, but nevertheless, I think it's definitely important. So the one on the left is to advocate for and incentivize tech platform product and policy changes to reduce disinformation. So part of this is advocacy and trying to change the big platforms, social media platforms are what many of us are on every day. Trying to get access to research, also trying to get access to data to do our own research. But then I think like setting aside the big platforms, this is also talking about how we can better incentivize through policy instruments, for example, the development of more pro-social technology that can combat disinformation, and doing our own and continued research. I mean, this is already happening, but continuing to do research on the specific affordances of technology that either help to spread disinformation so that we can counter it, or that do the opposite. And then finally, the last one is to imagine and design new pro-social tech platforms and build bridges with the technology community. So this is really about fostering local tech for good ecosystems, maybe peace tech incubators, bridging these expertise between technologists and peace builders, and of course, cross-discipline collaboration. So that's a quick run through of our 7 recommendations, and I look forward to discussing them more in the panel.
Yeah, thank you, Emma, for sharing your assessment, especially all your 7 recommendations, which makes it very clear also what you said in the beginning, that interdisciplinary systematic approaches and strategies are needed, and also looking at the root causes, so going down the pyramid, as you mentioned already a couple of times, and of course, localized peace building, but also really engage with new actors like the platforms. and others. Yeah, but now I like to turn to Julie Hawk and to the other discussant. First to Julie, thanks for being here. Julie, you're a research lead at Buildup, and you can draw from a vast experience in digital peace building, as Buildup is one of the leading digital peace building organizations that implements program, conducts research, and develop technical solutions in many conflict contexts. And also Buildup holds an annual conference to discuss pressing topics on digital peace building. And you have already a decade of experience in third-party conflict engagement, global youth education, and digital peace building programming, design, and management. So with this background, I'd like to pose the following question to you. How did the findings of the study resonate with you? And from your experience working at Buildup on disinformation, do you share similar learnings?
Thank you for the question, Nina. You pre-asked it before, but I've sort of scrapped all ideas having heard the presentation of both Grace and Emma, so thank you both. I found that really interesting and a great summary. I really appreciated the report, in particular the look at systems and in particular the sort of generation pipeline that you outlined and the different motivations of those that you have there. I think that one mistake that we make when we talk about disinformation is treating it as if it's this like external toxin that is polluting an otherwise healthy media environment, which we know like isn't true and has never been true. And which, Nina, I think you spoke a little bit when you said like this is not new, but I think it's a little bit more than not new. I think it's like foundational even. It's foundational to our current policies, like across many of the places that we live in, is that there would be multiple realities and that some people will be scapegoated in order to create the realities that a dominant group lives in. So just to like center an understanding of disinformation in a localized history and place and power and identity. So I really resonated with that kind of, you looking at systems and also bringing motivations to the forefront. And starting to look at identity with kind of gender, but I think there's others that we could add there as well. To kind of, I guess from my experience in seeing this done and doing it with Buildup and with, partners around the world, maybe just like uplifting a few lessons there, or examples of those doing it. I think like towards your point of decolonization, I think, that's a good recognition to kind of like get at decolonization. I think maybe a slightly different framing than kind of like centering the local so that it can be used as building blocks or learning or amplified in that way. I think it's like what we learn there is that like a decolonial methodology is rooted in kind of place, it's rooted in relationship, it's rooted in praxis, and in like a full recognition of and a negotiation with power. And I think like those are things peace builders have been doing for a long time, and sometimes like before with terms other than disinformation. Like I think, for a long time we could have referred to a lot of this as rumor management, which peace builders have a long history of doing. And I still kind of like that because that kind of speaks to peace builders who are doing this like towards interrupting an acute harm, was always implied by rumor management. And so what comes to mind with that example is an old one, but it's this organization in Sudan called Sudia, who a long time ago, like 15 years ago, 20 years ago, had created an SMS text message line along nomadic routes that would sort of intake reports, check them, and then distribute those back out to kind of key informants along these routes. And this was like with direct impact of if there were concerns about raids or concerns about something happening along the route, that this would be able to kind of like stop that in its tracks. So I think that's disinformation response that's inspiring because it's place-based, it's like an acute harm being responded to. And then I think beyond acute harms, there's kind of like, as your report, I think well mentions, is the sort of more chronic harm, which is spread across. And so maybe just amplifying a really great organization in Myanmar, where this is a big topic, given how quickly internet came online and Facebook being the primary provider of that internet. There's this organization called the MIDO, like Myanmar ICT, I'm going to mess up, Myanmar ICT for Development Organization. I think that's it. It's MIDO. And they kind of have this sort of broader approach and in tackling disinformation, but more than that, as I think you'd find many of the peace builders are doing. But like one thing that they did was create a fact-checking chatbot. And that was like before chatbots were a thing. Like they were really ahead of the curve on that. But they were only able to do that because they had built such a foundation beforehand of doing community-based work, of doing trainings about digital literacy, about like training people on how to use their mobile phones. You know, they had done a lot of foundational work that made them be trusted in that space. So those are just two examples that come to mind. And then some broader thoughts on the report. And I hope that's useful. And please let me know if there's any follow-ups.
Thanks, Julie, for for giving your insights and also how the report resonates with you. And I think it's super interesting that you shared this example from Myanmar and Sudan, that also those approaches are not new, that we really also should look around the world, what's happening already, and learn from what is out there already. Looking at the time, I would straight go now to John, and coming from first we had the peace building perspectives, but now turning to John, who can bring insights and his experience from the field of psychology to our conversation. John, thank you for joining us today, also especially here in our peace building bubble. John is a lecturer in psychology and security at King's College London, and also he has recently published a book, The Psychology of Misinformation. So, John, your research covered topics such as understanding and countering mis and disinformation and how group forms strong beliefs and identities. And also you look at the psychologically drivers of it and think again also how digital technologies plays into it. So I think you have a great background to give us your insights. So how did your findings of the report resonate with you? And especially, how do you see the research on cognitive science can inform enhanced peace building efforts? Over to you.
Thank you, Nina. Everyone can hear me, right? I assume. Okay, good. It was very interesting to read from a psychological perspective, for sure. I think the research that was done to write the report on the cognitive social identity drivers of misbeliefs, if you will, covered the relevant topics very well. So that was very impressive. One thing that I think the report does very well is that it kind of emphasizes this need to move away from two things. One, to see this as a problem that exists in isolation, and two, to focus to move away from focusing too much on falsehoods, explicit, outright lies, and also focus more on sort of the broader, I guess, ecosystem that exists around this industry almost, right, that exists in that we might call the disinformation industry. And that is because most of the time you don't really need to lie to mislead or misinform people. You can sort of leave out relevant context or use excessive emotions and these kinds of things. And so that also means that if we're talking about disinformation, we're talking about much more than just falsehoods. We're talking about an organized attempt in a way to achieve certain goals, because personally I see disinformation as strategic, not ideological, at least not ideological in nature. It takes on sort of certain ideological flavors, if you will, but those ideological flavors are very much informed by present day politics, right? And not necessarily by an actual kind of underlying belief system most of the time. So recognizing that encountering disinformation going forward is I think very helpful. A few other things that I think are worth pointing out from the report are the call for resource pooling, for donors to have a bit more of a comprehensive strategy as to what they're actually funding, as opposed to sort of sinking a little bit of money into one project, right? Kind of trying to see what is their strategic kind of cohesion behind the projects that we're encouraging researchers and policymakers and practitioners and NGOs and so on to pursue. What I like, of course, being an academic, right? I like to think of myself as a scientist, although, you know, social scientist, so I don't really uncover the laws of nature at all. Unfortunately, just the laws of human behavior, if they exist, who knows? But what I like in this domain is a comprehensive and thorough impact assessment. And that is one of those things that we as scientists struggle tremendously with, right? What works, for how long, for whom does it work, who chooses to engage with the interventions that we design, right? Be they media literacy or nudging or something else, and why would they choose to not engage with those interventions? That's another tremendously difficult question, right? But an impact assessment, speaking from personal experience, right, is fairly often pretty disappointing, which is to say, we don't very often or even usually find what we want, what we're looking for, right? And I think that is fine to acknowledge, but also that is one of those things that I believe when we're talking to donors, when we're in conversations with people who have expectations about what we're able to achieve, right, in terms of, well, countering disinformation, but in a variety of other domains as well, that we don't always achieve what we want to achieve, and we learn lessons nonetheless, which is valuable in a million different ways, right? But it is also difficult to kind of have a difficult conversation about that from time to time. A final thing that I wanted to point out is that I'm glad to be in this conversation because, again, speaking from experience, we as academics do not know what works in practice. We know what works in a lab very often, and then we kind of try to make things that we are hoping people will adopt in real life, right? You know, a game, say, or something like that. But we don't know what makes people tick, what makes people think, oh, this is really fun. I love this, whatever, media literacy program, right? So that's something that we can learn a lot from. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, John. And actually, the last point what you just made, I wanted to have ask you more about it, as you know, or I know that you developed this game-breaking harmony game, which exposed users to disinformation. And you describe the approach as a psychological inoculation, like a vaccine. And your assumption is that being exposed to the techniques you use to spread information, players build up resilience with this practice. So what is with your experience with this game? Would you recommend that Peacebuilders integrate those approaches in their work? And what are the pitfalls? Very brief, please, because we are running. The time is running.
I'll do my best to be brief. Yeah. Like the game is basically a humorous way to get people to engage with the common forms of manipulation that they might encounter, right? Like, what's the role of emotion? What's the role of conspiracy theories? How do you polarize groups and so on? Which I think the key element that we tried to sort of get at was what makes you choose to play a game. And one of the ways is humor, right? But it's certainly not the only one. And also not everyone shares the same sense of humor. So this is the thing that I would stress the most, right? It's most important that people think what you're doing is entertaining, is fun, is something they would voluntarily engage with. And then the second question I would say is, does it also work in terms of learning outcomes, let's say, right? That's question number 2. But question number 1 is, how do you attract people to something? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your insight also on the game and your learnings there. Yeah, now I actually would like to know, ask a question also, one question from the chat which goes into a similar direction, and please, you can post more questions in the chat. What intervention are you recently find most promising to mitigate the spread of information, and where do you see the most potential, particularly with a focus on peace-building organizations? And what would you drop? Does any one of you have an answer to that? Who wants to go?
I think I can jump in. And just to kind of amplify one of the case studies that we looked at in this work that I found super fascinating. But the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue facilitates these social media peace agreements, where they work directly with conflict actors to kind of set up a set of protocols similar to a peace agreement to govern online behavior, because they recognize that kind of there's these protocols that exist for kind of behavior of outright conflict, but there wasn't always terms of service or rules that kind of mitigated online behavior as well. And they learned a lot through this process of how kind of different conflict actors will work through kind of proxy accounts to post kind of false information online, as well as through their own channels as well. And so I thought that work was really promising in terms of sort of getting to the roots of conflict and understanding sort of why these actors are pushing along these narratives while also setting up kind of tangible resources to be able to resolve it as well. So that was just one I wanted to amplify from the research that I found super fascinating, but I'll let anyone else speak up as well.
I'll jump in, so we don't lose time also waiting for the volunteers. That's a great recommendation, Grace. I second that one. I would also say I'm personally interested in I mean, I'm in a room surrounded by posters that are all about like hacking and data for good and these types of things. So I'm interested more in this kind of pro-social tech, peace tech development, really thinking through those affordances of what we can develop. And then if something that I would maybe drop, I'm hesitant to say that there's anything across the board that we should drop, but I think the thing I'm most maybe suspicious about is some of these programs like the fact checking or Flagger or partner programs, which I think sound good. And I think that's why in some cases they probably are. But I think a lot of these, they can get extractive quite easily. Also, it depends, like a lot of times these are volunteer led and so on. So I worry about small organizations being, big tech platforms being extracted to individuals and small organizations. So that's the one I raise a red flag about.
Yeah, thanks, Grace and Emma, for sharing your examples. Maybe Julie, do you have another example also from your work at Build Up? What you like to share?
Yeah, it's funny. The one that was coming to mind, actually, what's coming to mind is that it's interesting how success is defined. Like in some cases, success, if you have like effectively countered a disinformation at an individual level, is just that they delete their original post, you know? And then it's like there's a null there that still means, and they might be more careful to do it next time. But I think like practical recommendations in terms of that, that the project that comes from, and then several others like it, I think is just like an identity resonance and a recognition of why that misinformation or disinformation is coming to them. And then also a relationship, like having a trusted relationship, because it's so much of disinformation or being susceptible to it is about distrust. But then I think you outlined in the report, Grace and Emma, and there are several others about really practical tactics, if that what that question is getting to, around pre-bunking or about truth sandwiches, or there are several of these types of things that I think you outlined in the report.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. There's a question from Niger. What would you suggest to counter disinformation in African countries? Do you have a specific suggestion for that?
I'll jump in. I think that there won't be a one size fits all for all African countries, but maybe an organization to look into is Defy Hate Now. And they've had some really interesting disinformation response work in Uganda and South Sudan, including a kind of campaign where they had a R&B artist and events, and the campaign was called Think Before You Click. And so they were kind of like inoculating people to the idea that they couldn't trust everything online, and they did it in a really like cultural, artistic way that was cool. So that could be someone that you look at.
John, you would like to add?
I'm sorry.
I have myself conducted many studies in Africa, some parts of Asia, and specifically in India that have been wildly unsuccessful. So I have my own share of failed intervention studies, if you will, to be embarrassed about. But one of the learnings from that, I think, is that this is an old kind of truism in development studies, maybe even, I'm not really sure where it originates, but it's the saying goes, programs work, interventions don't, pretty much, right? Which is to say, I think there is this tendency in my field, at least, and among my colleagues, towards kind of quick fixes, right? We need to test this thing that happens in isolation, be it like a pre-bunk or a game or you know, media literacy, I don't know, like an hour-long course, something like that. And then we test if it works, usually immediately, right? Not after a delay of a week, say, but sort of right after you, I don't know, play a game, watch a video or something like that. And then we declare success and then we move on with our lives, but that isn't really enough. That's not how it works, because people forget things and people get bored of things and people have other stuff to do, and all of that is very reasonable. And so in that sense, right, like what makes things successful, what makes things stick is a serious and concerted effort that takes place over a longer time period with committed involvement from the people that you're, you know, trying to help, trying to benefit, which also assumes that they want that, right? Which isn't always the case. A lot of people are like, I don't really see why I need this, right? So these are all of these kind of considerations that we as scientists are not very good at kind of acknowledging, which is unfortunate. So it is good to see that the report is so sort of straightforward about that. So I like that.
Yeah, thanks, John, for sharing your experience. There's actually a question on art, like a totally different direction, but I also would like to pose it because it's interesting. Emma and Grace, did you think about actually like art, and can it be part of counter disinformation?
I can start. I was not, it wasn't the core part of what we looked at, I would say, actually. Although, yeah, it's a great point to bring up, and it's something that I actually like to think about. Actually, I mean, we do have a case study from Policy, an organization in Uganda, and it's not talking about this project, but I would recommend to the person asking this to check out their portfolio work, because they have done some data stories on murals, and I think some of those were related to disinformation. So actually it's a great idea. It would have been something with more time that we could have expanded on. And it yeah, because I think there is a way, kind of what John was talking about with the purpose of the game, like to be fun and then to draw people in and make it a learning experience. I think art is another great avenue for this.
Thanks, Emma, for sharing. Really looks like you wanted to say something. I'm not sure.
I mean, I am all for artistic interventions in whatever form. Yeah, I was actually just thinking of another example from Myanmar. It was a campaign called Flower Speech, and people held flowers in their mouths, and this sort of spread to a wide network. And I think that that's just one example of an artistic intervention, though there are many. And art has always been sort of like foundational to questioning set narratives, and especially those that are based on identity-based hierarchies. So I think art has been a powerful tool for a long time for this.
Yeah, thank you, Julie. There's another question in the chat, and what conversation are taking place with current social media apps to encourage this arena to adapt the findings? And also this goes a little bit to another question I had, like for the rest of the couple of minutes we have, more on the governance side and also and the policy side. I also know the build up you approached platforms in recent years. So what is your experience there and your learning?
Maybe can I ask you to clarify your question a little bit? You mean generally or like on this topic?
Generally.
Yeah. It's interesting. Various platforms handle this differently. I think many folks who are probably on this call know about like the trusted partner program that Meta has. And that's been one way in which we've been able to have concerns taken up. But it's also probably a problem that is an exclusive role that not everyone gets to play, and trusted partners are leaned on to do a lot of this content moderation work. So to be seen what this looks like in the future as it's made its changes. And other platforms like handle this differently. So yeah, it'll be really interesting to see now as kind of like a widespread shift and all the big platforms are happening, what policy will land on here.
Thank you, Julie. Does someone else would like to contribute to what you
Yeah.
hear? Yes.
I can jump in. I think this is somewhat outside of the platforms themselves as to what they're doing, but a resource that I found super fascinating over the past few years is the Pro-Social Design Network. They kind of have a toolkit of various interventions for building more pro-social online spaces. They do a lot of research in terms of validating different solutions. And so they're definitely linked in the paper, so I would recommend checking them out because they kind of crowdsource a lot of this research to show kind of what interventions would be useful. So if you're kind of thinking about what to bake into your own tech platforms, if you're creating an alternative space, that's a really good resource to check out. And yeah, that was something I want to highlight.
Maybe
Thank-
one more that
yeah.
I'll mention, it's actually a build-up example, but Julie didn't say it, so I'll throw it out there that I like that. I mean, I also think in terms of governance, there's chance for more creative thinking around this. And Helena from Build Up a couple of years ago now published a paper about taxing social media companies as negative externalities. And I think this is an idea that has really stuck with, I think, many of us who read that paper, and I like to keep it in mind as like different ways that we can approach policies as well as like regulating or policies around these the effects of these tech platforms.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. I think creative ideas, how we can combat disinformation is really needed. I think we really have to look outside the box. Looking at the time, we have like 5 minutes left. I would slowly start to wrap up and ask you like the last question to everyone. What are the next steps you will be busy with encountering disinformation in the future?
I think for myself personally, in the kind of immediate future, is keeping up my research with Notre Dame, kind of studying how peace-building communication tactics can help train AI LLMs to better respond and detect to hate speech on social platforms, which also gets into the questions of disinformation. But I think in the long term, how I'm exiting this paper and kind of these months-long conversations is really thinking about those broader social questions of how do we relate to one another? How do we want to design better online spaces to encourage better conversations and dialogue? And start thinking, as we were saying, kind of more creatively about solutions that we can apply in this space.
And like maybe Emma, yeah.
I am similarly, I'm working at this cross-discipline area. I'm focusing on the design aspect and also, these questions of how to build trust in digital spaces, but also I've been working a lot recently on building bridges between technologists and peace builders. And now I'm bringing in designers, like visual designers as well, and discovering many of the same pitfalls, but also the joys and challenges of these cross collaborations. So bringing in a design focus is one of the areas that I'm really focusing on, and a little bit of art as well, how this can help us make more trusted spaces mostly focus on in digital spaces.
Thanks, Emma. Julie and John, do you have any answer to the question?
I can start. I think to the extent that disinformation is centered on content, I think I want to narrow that content down when engaged in a peace building program, and not to treat it as this global like virus or something nebulous, but that like the content I'm looking for is disinformation about a very specific peace building goal that I have. And I think most often the answer to that question will not be disinformation about what, but it will be disinformation about who. And I want to center that question on the who and the kind of justice that we're seeking in peace work. So I want to think more about that.
Thanks, Julie. John?
Yeah, good question. I think one of the things that I've started to look at is the underlying kind of manipulation market, which is to say, like, there's a whole kind of underground kind of black market almost dedicated to, for example, fake accounts, fake likes, and these kinds of things, and that it's almost never talked about in terms of a market. So that is a very interesting way forward in a way.
Yeah, thank you. I think we almost like at the end of our session, it unfortunately passed too fast, but I think it really shows that there are no easy solution to counter spread of information, but there are a lot of ideas. And I think, as I said before, we need a lot of creativity. And what also came clear that we really need kind of multi-level collaborative efforts across sectors, particularly with platform, with research institution, also in other disciplines. And I think also what I just like to mention in the end, that also it's crucial to bring our like unique skill sets into play, like for example, that we can help in building trust again, where trust is losing within communities. Yeah, and I just wanted to highlight this in the end. Yeah, but thanks again. We already hit the hour. It was a really interesting conversation. Thank you for your time, and also thank you for everyone who joined us today. I think we got a lot of food for thoughts, and I think we have to continue the discussion. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. And if you want to look into the video again, also some people said we talked a little bit too fast, and you can check it again. Sorry for that. It will be online in the coming days, and we will also publish a blog article on the main findings of this panel discussion. Yeah, thank you again for joining, and have a wonderful evening or morning or afternoon, depending in which time zone you are. And yeah, hopefully see you again. Bye.